everyone. It's great to be back with you for another deep dive. And I know you've been doing some really fascinating research lately, especially about autism and women's experiences.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that needs a lot more attention, and we've got a lot to cover today.
We do a whole mix of stuff, articles, and personal stories, and even some insights from advocacy
It's
groups.
gonna be great.
For sure. And, today I thought we could zero in on something that's particularly concerning. I mean, we're talking about the ways autistic women experience victim blaming,
Oh, yeah.
especially when it comes to gender-based violence or harassment. I mean, this is something that sadly a lot of women face. But for autistic women, it can get even more complicated.
It really can. Actually, one of the sources you sent an article from the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. I mean, they put it perfectly. They talk about how it's like this double whammy.
Right.
Like, not only are there all these societal norms that lead to victim blaming in general,
Right.
but then on top of that, you have this extra layer of being misunderstood because of being autistic.
It's like being hit from both sides.
Exactly.
Okay, but before we go too far, I think it's important to make sure we're on the same page about what we even mean when we say victim blaming.
Right.
Because you hear the term all the time, but how would you define it in this context?
Well, at its heart, victim blaming is shifting the responsibility away from the person who actually did something wrong
Okay.
and like putting it onto the person who was harmed. And it can be really sneaky because a lot of times it sounds like concern or even advice.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like you might hear things like, well, what were you wearing? Or
Mm.
why were you out so late after someone's been assaulted?
Ugh. Yeah.
And those questions, they're kind of implying that the victim somehow invited the attack,
Yeah.
which just isn't true.
No, of course not. It's like saying you deserve to be robbed because you were carrying an expensive phone.
Right, exactly. It totally ignores the fact that stealing is wrong, no matter what.
Totally. And I'm thinking about all that research, and it makes me wonder, do you think stereotypes about autism make this whole thing even harder?
Absolutely. You see, lots of autistic people, and especially women, are so good at what we call masking their traits.
Masking.
So,
Okay.
yeah, basically it means trying to fit in, appear neurotypical. But when we're talking about victim blaming, that can totally backfire.
How so?
Okay, so imagine an autistic woman is assaulted, but she's been masking.
Okay.
She might seem neurotypical to others, so people start wondering why she didn't see warning signs or react in a way they think is appropriate.
Like they just assume she should have known better.
Right. They might say things like, well, she seemed fine, or she didn't seem scared, not realizing that what they saw on the outside might not have been what was actually going on inside.
That's awful.
It is, and that's really where those dangerous societal norms we talked about collide with the misunderstanding of autism.
So it's not just the victim blaming in general, but how autism is perceived in these situations.
Exactly. There's this assumption that autistic individuals lack social awareness, or they just don't understand danger, which is so untrue.
Yeah.
I mean, they might process information differently or express themselves in ways that other people don't get, but that doesn't mean they can't understand consent or experience trauma.
That's such an important point to clarify. And it makes me think about those personal stories you mentioned where women felt totally invalidated after being abused because they were autistic.
Yeah.
One that sticks in my mind is a woman who was sexually assaulted and then told she must have misinterpreted the situation because of her autism.
Oh, yeah, that was rough. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained those misconceptions are, even among people who should be helping and supporting survivors.
It's like you're being punished for who you are and for experiencing the world in a way that's different. And then to have to deal with the invalidation and disbelief on top of the trauma of the assault.
Exactly. And that invalidation, it really can impact someone's mental health and well-being. Just imagine being told over and over that your experience wasn't real or that you somehow caused it.
Ugh, I can't even imagine.
It really does chip away at your self-esteem and make it so much harder to heal. And it goes even further. It's not just that immediate impact.
What do you mean?
Well, this kind of victim blaming it can really make it harder for autistic women to even ask for help in the future.
Oh, I see. Like they don't even want to come forward.
Exactly.
You mentioned the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network before, and in one of their articles, they talked about how a lot of autistic women experience gaslighting, not just from abusers, but from people who are supposed to be helping them.
It happens way too often.
Ugh, it's just awful.
Gaslighting, it's a form of manipulation where the abuser makes the victim doubt their own sanity, like their perception of reality.
Wow.
It can be so damaging, especially for someone who already has social anxiety or is afraid of not being
Right,
believed.
because it's like a double trap. First, you're vulnerable because of the abuse, and then they make you feel like you can't even trust your own instincts
Exactly.
or your memories. I can see why someone wouldn't reach out for help after that.
And then you add in all the societal dynamics that silence women, and it creates this perfect storm for autistic women to be dismissed and just believed.
Yeah, you mentioned power dynamics earlier, and I realized we haven't really talked about what those look like in this situation. I mean, obviously misogyny exists,
Right.
but how does that play into victim blaming when we're specifically talking about autistic women?
Well, for one thing, patriarchal structures are really ingrained in our society. And basically, those are systems that privilege men
Oh, I see.
and male perspectives. And those systems, they contribute to this idea that women are just less credible or
Oh,
less capable than men.
Hmm.
Think about it. How often are women interrupted in meetings or talked over in conversations?
Yeah, that happens all the time.
Or their ideas are given to male colleagues?
Hmm.
I mean, these are small things, but they're everywhere. And they're examples of how these structures play out in everyday life.
So it's like this underlying message that women's voices don't matter as much. And if that's true for women in general, I can't even imagine how hard it is for autistic women who are already dealing with being misunderstood.
You're right. It's a huge problem.
And then there's the stereotype of women as passive or submissive, which creates a really dangerous situation where autistic women might be seen as easy targets
Sadly. Yeah.
because they're not expected to fight back.
Exactly. And I can't stress enough how wrong that is. Autistic women, they're just as diverse as any other group.
Sure.
Some are assertive, some are quieter, but none of that means anyone has the right to harm them.
That's so true. So we've talked about how victim blaming shows up and how stereotypes about autism and power structures make things worse. We even talked about how it prevents people from getting help. So what can we do about it?
Yeah.
Because it can feel really overwhelming.
It is a huge problem.
Hmm.
But there are definitely things we can do as individuals to help.
Like what?
I think the first step is education. The more people understand about autism and how victim blaming works, the less likely they are to keep doing it.
Okay, so like what? Teach a class?
Uh-huh. No, I mean, talk to your friends, share articles online, have those conversations that challenge misconceptions.
Okay, that makes sense. You know, one of the articles talked about bystander intervention, like that saying, see something, say something.
Yeah,
But in this case, it's more about seeing those subtle forms of victim blaming and calling them out.
exactly. And you don't have to be confrontational about it. Sometimes just asking a question can make a difference.
Give me an example.
Sure,
Yeah.
like if someone says, well, she shouldn't have been walking alone at night, you could just say something like, it's not her fault. No one asks to be assaulted, no matter what time it is or where they are.
Right. It's not about the victim's behavior. It's about the person who did something wrong.
Yes. And sometimes the most powerful thing is just to acknowledge what the victim went through. Like saying, I believe you, or it's not your fault. That can really help someone who's feeling dismissed and disbelieved.
So it's all about educating people, intervening when we see it happening, and supporting survivors in a way that really validates their feelings and centers their experiences. Okay, I like that.
Oh, and I wanted to add one more thing about how we talk about autism. One of the articles you sent mentioned person-first language versus identity-first language.
Okay, remind me what that is.
Well, there's debate in the autistic community about which is better, but the main point is to respect what people prefer.
Like saying autistic person instead of person with autism.
Exactly. It recognizes that being autistic is part of who someone is, and it's not something to be ashamed of.
That makes sense. And it makes me think about how the media portrays autistic people, especially women. It's like they're always helpless victims or these quirky geniuses.
And both of those are so limiting. They don't let autistic people just be regular people.
And it can feed into those same ideas that lead to victim blaming.
Exactly. We need more realistic portrayals of autistic people in the media, and we need to listen to what they have to say.
Let them tell their own stories
Yes.
and challenge those stereotypes. You know, it feels like one of the most important things is to create spaces where people can be heard and respected.
It is. And that doesn't just mean media representation. It means building a culture of listening, empathy, and understanding.
Wow, it feels like we've covered so much ground, but I also feel like we're just scratching the surface of this whole thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that really shows how complex this is. It's not a simple problem with simple solutions.
Yeah, for sure.
We have to examine our own biases and how they might play into this whole thing.
That's a good point. It makes me think about something else I read in the research about moving past just awareness you know,
Right.
and actually taking action to challenge victim blaming.
Awareness is important, don't get me wrong. It's definitely the foundation,
Okay.
but it's not enough on its own. We've got to turn that awareness into real change.
So what would that look like? I mean, what can we as individuals do to actually make a difference?
Well, for one thing, think about how you consume media. Pay attention to how autistic characters are portrayed in movies and TV shows or even books.
Hmm.
Are they presented as real people with their own thoughts and motivations?
Yeah.
Or are they just there to push the plot forward or reinforce stereotypes?
I see what you mean.
And if you see something that doesn't sit right with you, speak up. Write a letter, leave a comment on social media, or talk to your friends.
Yeah. Use your voice to demand better representation and, like you said, hold media creators accountable.
Exactly. And don't forget those organizations we mentioned, like the National Domestic Violence Hotline or the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network and the Autism Women's Network.
Yeah.
They do such incredible work, but they need our help.
Okay, so like what? Donating.
Yeah. Donate if you can, or volunteer your time. Even just following them on social media and spreading their message makes a big difference.
You know, sometimes it feels like all we can do is chip away at these big problems.
I know what you mean.
But I guess even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Definitely. They really can. And don't underestimate the power of simply listening to and believing autistic women. Just creating a space where they feel safe to talk about what they've been through without judgment.
So much of this boils down to just being a decent person,
Yes.
treating each other with respect, and realizing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity no matter their differences.
It really is that simple sometimes. We've got to challenge those biases that make us judge people based on their abilities or disabilities.
Right, recognizing that different ways of thinking are normal. We're all enriched by the different perspectives and skills that autistic people bring to the table.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm.
And honestly, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Let's keep learning, keep listening, and keep working towards a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been really insightful. And to all of you listening, I hope this has given you some things to think about and some actions you can take to make a real difference. Remember, even small actions can lead to big changes, and together we can build a world where autistic women are empowered, not victimized.